I think it was a classic example of one rule for one and another rule for the rest. When the local government board was deciding council amalgamations, and obviously every member of parliament had a keen interest in this because they wanted to keep their local councils happy. And I can remember that the provisional recommendations when it came to the Premier's electorate and council was to put them in the city of Whitehorse, which would basically put them in Box Hill. And I can remember people telling me that Mrs Kennett had received complaints from the neighbours about this. And so the Premier duly came back and basically ran roughshod over Roger Hallam, the local government minister, and the board, and got it changed. So with the final report, they were back in Camberwell, in a far more respectable situation, and receiving less pressure from the neighbours. So it's a classic example of one rule for the Premier and another rule for the rest.
What do you see as the common thread running through all these stories? What issues do they raise about the Kennett style?
Oh, well, it's a clear blind spot when it comes to sort of potential conflicts of interest. It's a crash-through approach. It's a certainly look after yourself and your interest. It's a get things done attitude. Less concerned about process, more concerned about results, and it certainly has achieved some great things in Victoria, but some pretty serious corners have been cut as well.
Why have you decided to raise these concerns now? Why didn't you talk about it at the time?
Well, when I left, I only knew of these two share floats, for instance. I didn't know that Matheson and Lee had approached him first. I didn't know there'd been a taxpayer-funded reception for Guangdong at Parliament House. I didn't know the extent of the oversubscriptions. I didn't know there'd been a statement to the stock exchange saying that the float was oversubscribed. With the casino, I didn't know at the time when I was working there that what was going to happen. The defamation settlement happened after I left. The Grollo settlement happened after I left. So basically, I've been watching the government for 3 years as a journalist, writing about all these things quite aggressively as they come up. I mean, my relations are very strained with the Premier now. He's tried to get me sacked. He's, rang up my bosses, complained, and tried to undermine me, attacked me on radio, all that sort of stuff. And basically, I've reached the point watching a whole series of things and watching the culture, and just things I've heard recently, like Mrs Kennett is telling people that she's earning more money than the Premier is at the moment. And you've got the issue of the free BMW, and you've got the issue of the arrangements with Spotless, where the Premier's looking after the Arts Centre, and Spotless is the company that does the catering there, and they have some sort of arrangement whereby Mrs Kennett's employed by Spotless, and then apparently son Angus is working there at Spotless, and these things have just all sort of incrementally built up to a point where I think it's in the public interest that it come out in some shape or form. I think the culture in Victoria is now to the point where the Auditor General is getting attacked, the Parliament's sitting, less than it ever has. The Premier's wife's out there, with a fully renovated office in One Treasury Place with a staff member, and from that position she's actually, earning more money than the Premier is. And just the culture is that these things are tolerated. Conflicts are not a problem. In any other state, there'd be ministers would have resigned. There'd be backbench concern about probity and process. And Jeff just runs it with such an iron fist. And there's so many people out there who are not prepared to stick their head up and speak out publicly that I've sort of come to the point that I've decided that it's in the public interest to do that.
Tell me how the Premier tried to get you sacked.
I wrote one piece about gambling, saying that when they gave, I think I said something like that giving Crown another 150 tables and a cheap tax rate and charging them only $85 million when Treasury said it was worth $274 million, the only conclusion you can reach from that is that the government was either grossly incompetent or was looking after its mates. And this just outraged him, and he rang up, I think he might have even rung up Ken Cowley, the chairman of News Limited, and had some form of meeting to complain, along with the editorial chief in Melbourne. And to their credit, I only heard about this sort of third hand a bit later, and there was never any suggestion that I'd stop writing what I was writing or that I'd changed my tune or anything like that. But the mere fact that he attempts to do that, and he regularly, when I was working for him, used to ring up board members and chief executives of media companies and complain about journalists. I mean, he had absolutely no idea about this concept that journalists are independent from management. Advertising and editorial content have nothing to do with each other, and the idea that free speech and a good, vibrant, aggressive media is important. I mean, the culture in there was that journalists get in the way, that journalists are a necessary nuisance, well, not a necessary nuisance, but something that you know, are just a pain, and that you would try and talk them down, and the culture in there was that journalists are all scum and they're what a terrible profession, and you wouldn't want to go back to being a journalist, and what point do they serve? And it was a culture that was very, very anti the principles of journalism, which I still think are very important. And then if you combine that with everything else that incrementally has become public over the last 3 years, I've just sort of reached the point where I think enough is enough.
How do you expect the Premier to respond to what you're saying?
He'll attack me personally, no doubt, and he'll just say I'm some form of embittered former staff member trying to run some sort of a campaign. And I mean, it's all pretty predictable. He'll accuse me of attacking his wife, as he accuses anyone. He sort of hides behind Felicity when he can politically. And no doubt he'll sort of tell people that I'll never work again in Victoria, and that I've left the country, and it's gutless to leave the country and talk about these things openly. I mean, it's all quite predictable. That's what he'll say. He won't address the issues. He won't come out and say, yes, I shouldn't have done this with Guangdong, I shouldn't have done this with Yates, I should disclose the defamation settlement, I shouldn't have dealt with my brother-in-law on the Grollo's headquarters. He won't acknowledge that. He'll just skirt over that and just and sort of wheel out the old invective and attack me and accuse the media of beating it all up, and then life will probably go on as normal.
Okay, thanks.